So this video is all about compression fittings, where you should use them, where you shouldn't use them, and I'm going to show you 4+1 different ways to join them together so you don't get a leak. Because as I always say, no one wants a leak. And I'm also going to show you my recommendations for using compression fittings on plastic pipework. And as I'm constantly telling people in my videos how to make compression fittings, I thought I'd make this one video which covers all the methods. Now, to everyone who watched my last video where I said my next video was going to be all about the flushing kit which I was using, I decided to do this video first about compression fittings because most likely you're going to need to put some compression fittings onto your pipework. But if you do want to know about that flushing kit I was using, that will definitely be in the next video. So I'll leave that video linked in the cards above, and you'll also find it down in the description. Whilst I mentioned the description, you'll find lots of other videos which are made all about how to help you with your central heating and your gas boilers, how to fix those leaks, change radiator valves, how to make your system more efficient so you reduce your gas bill. Right, now let's get on with this video all about compression fittings. So first off, where and where shouldn't you use compression fittings? Now, the building regulations are pretty clear on this. Compression fittings should only be used in accessible locations. So what is an accessible location? Basically, anywhere where you can get to the joint easily. Because compression fittings, over some time, they can actually start leaking. So if they do start to leak, you need to get to them to repair them and stop the leak. So where should you not fit compression fittings? Well, underneath floors, because that is not classified as accessible. Behind kitchen cupboards, that is not accessible. Basically, behind anything that you have to dismantle it to get to that fitting, that is not accessible. Now, if you have a panel which has a label on it and you can easily remove it to get to the fittings, that's fine. But I rarely see compression fittings behind kitchen cupboards boxed in. You can't get to it without literally pulling the kitchen apart. And that definitely does not comply with the building regulations. And I see this happening all the time. And it's really frustrating when I see a well-known DIY program on the TV where they make a big mistake. They cut through a load of pipes in the floor and then they join them back together with compression fittings and then cover them all over with cement, which is definitely against the building regulations, because if those joints leak in the future, you have to dig the floor up to get to them, which is completely wrong. Right, now let's get on with how to seal these joints together. Now here's a whole lot of fittings which you expect to find all over your plumbing system in your house. Now all these are compression fittings, but these over here are threaded fittings. Now here's a piece of copper tube, I've cut through it and I want to add a T in to maybe add a washing machine connection or maybe an outside tap, and then I can add my new connection into the T. Now let's take a quick look at what a compression fitting consists of. And importantly, what we need to do to make sure it is 100% leak free. Now, when we look inside our compression fitting, we can see here we have a chamfer going all the way around the edge of the fitting. And that's how we know it is a compression fitting. Now, when we take a look at this fitting here, it looks pretty much the same, but you can see this edge here, it's flat. It hasn't got that chamfer, that angle all the way around. Whereas at the other end, this is a compression fitting, and again, you can see that angle. So we know that this end is a compression joint. So how does a compression fitting work? Well, there's the threaded part, which is on the fitting. Now, for anyone interested, this is a BSP thread, British Standard Pipe. And the thread allows you to screw the nut onto the fitting, which compresses the olive onto the fitting and the pipe. Hence the name compression joint. Now, I want to be perfectly clear here, the thread has nothing to do with sealing the joint. It is there only to compress the olive. Now, myself and every other plumber around the world will see joints where PTFE tape has been wrapped around the screw thread in the belief that this is helping to seal the joint, where in fact it does absolutely nothing apart from bung up the threads. So there's absolutely no point in wrapping PTFE tape or applying lots of joining compounds to the thread because it's going to do absolutely nothing, apart from making it harder to screw the fitting together. Now, the parts that make the seal and stops your joint from leaking is where the olive pushes up against the seating and gets compressed onto the pipe. It's just those two places. So this is where we must pay the most attention. So here's my piece of 50mm tube. I put my nut on, I put my olive on, and then I put the fitting on. So when we do up the nut, it compresses the olive onto the fitting, which compresses the olive onto the pipe, sealing the joint. If you want to know a little bit more about the different olives you'll find, I'll run through those towards the end of the video. So how do we go about preparing these fittings so they do not leak? Now, the first method I'm going to show you is the method that I actually do not recommend. And that's just to put the joint together dry, like this. So we just put the nut on, we put the olive on, then we get our grips, and we hold the fitting. In this case, it's a radiator valve, and then we just do up the nut. So we just get our adjustable spanners, and we just do that up. Now, the reason I do not recommend this method is because I am regularly fixing joints which have been put together dry, and for some reason, they've started leaking. And some 30 years ago, when I first became a plumber, I did some pipework underneath a bath, I put a service valve in, I put the joint together dry, and a couple of months later, it started leaking. And from that date onwards, I have never put a compression fitting together without using some sort of additional sealing method. So how do we go about preparing this joint so it does not leak? Well, the most common DIY method would be to use PTFE tape. Now here I have some gas tape which must be used on gas fittings. And if we take a look at that, you can see the tape is a lot thicker than the standard PTFE tape. And in general, I only use this thicker tape on gas fittings. Now this is the way that we use PTFE tape with a compression fitting. Now I would hold the tape in my right hand and then wrap it around the olive. And I'm paying attention to keep the tape tight, and I'm only wrapping it around the front of the olive. Because remember, it's the front of the olive which does all the sealing. Now I do a couple of winds around the olive, and then if I want to, I can put a couple around the back as well. But remember, the back of the olive doesn't do any sealing at all. It's just the front of the olive, where it pushes up against the seating on the fitting. And if I wrap it around the back of the olive, I'm going to see some of that tape sticking out of the fitting. Once I'm happy I've wrapped enough tape around, I just pull the PTFE tape and snap it off and just wipe the PTFE tape around to make sure it's nice and smooth all the way around. Now I can get my fitting and I can put it onto the pipe. Then I can take the nut, push it onto the olive, and push the olive and the nut onto the fitting and do it up. And there we can see there, look, there's a little bit of PTFE tape sticking out of the back of the fitting. Now let's just undo that again and take a quick look at what's happened to the PTFE tape. And you can see that it's pushed up nicely onto the olive, forming a seal all the way around the edge of the olive. Now I can guarantee 100% that this would be a leak-free joint. So let's just get my two spanners and do this compression fitting up. And now I'm just going to tighten it up. Now it was just finger tight, and now I'm just doing up the nut. You don't have to go crazy tight with these. We're just nipping them up, and then one little nip up more, and then that is just about half a turn from finger tight. And like I said, I know that would be 100% a leak-free joint. Now you can see a bit of PTFE tape sticking out the bottom there, which may not be ideal. So if you wanted, you could just pull that off. It won't affect the joint at all. Now, sometimes if you're in a confined space, you can't use the roll. It's too big and you can't wrap it around the pipe. So then I would snap a bit of PTFE tape off and then wrap it around the olive that way. But again, you can see it's quite awkward to do. It keeps sticking to everything and it's just a bit awkward and time consuming. In general, I only use PTFE tape in certain locations where I think the joint actually might be a bit dodgy and I need a bit of belt and braces. But there's no doubt about it, PTFE tape is really good for sealing compression fittings. Now I can just pop on the fitting, I can push the olive up onto the seating, and then I can just get the nut, slide it on, and then just do it up finger tight, and now that is ready for doing up with the spanners. One last thing about using PTFE tape with compression fittings, it doesn't matter which way round you roll it around the olive. You could do it clockwise or anti-clockwise. But it does matter when you use PTFE tape on tapered threads. Now I'm going to show you the method which I use 99% of the time to seal compression fittings. Now this is a little pot which I've decanted some jet lube into. It's just an easy way of carrying around a small pot instead of the large, slightly heavier one. Now joinery compound is like a very sticky paste, and you wipe that onto the fitting and the olive, and that helps seal the joint. Now it's very sticky and it can be very messy. You can see here now it's stuck all over my finger. And it doesn't come off easily, but it's definitely much quicker to use. And when you put thousands of joints together like I have, time is important. So how do you go about applying joinery compound? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We just get some joinery compound, we wipe it around the pipe like that, and you can see I've got a nice covering all over the pipe. Then I'm just going to slide the olive down onto the paste like that. And then I can use a little more joinery compound and just wipe it over the front of the olive. Remembering again, it's the front of the olive which is doing all the sealing. So I got a nice covering over the olive and the pipe. And there we go, I think I'm happy with that. Now I can get the fitting and just push the pipe into the fitting. And then I can do up the nut. I can then get my spanners and do up the nuts nice and tight, exactly the same as I did with the PTFE tape. Just about half a turn from finger tight. But of course, depending on the joint, you might want to do it a bit tighter. So let's take a look at this joint now and undo the nut. Now let's take a look at the olive and the joinery compound. So we're carefully going to pull that apart. And now you can see what's happened. The joinery compound has gone all over the seating of the fitting, which is exactly what we want, creating a nice seal all the way around. And you can also see that the olive is also nicely covered. So that looks perfect to me. Now that's one method which I would use definitely when the pipe is looking a little bit dodgy, and I would definitely recommend this method for DIYers to use. But just an important note, we don't want to get any of this joinery compound down inside the pipe. So just watch out for that. So that is one method which I would use, and now I'm going to show you the method which I use pretty much all the time, and the method which I normally show on all my videos. So here's another compression fitting. Now this is a flat-faced service valve. It looks pretty much the same as this service valve, but they are different. So now I'm going to get some joinery compound again. Now rather than putting it on the olive, I'm going to put it onto the fitting. Now what I do here is to just wipe or smear a small amount of joinery compound all the way around the edge of the fitting. Basically just on the seating. Now I'm not going crazy with this. I'm not putting a great big blob which is going to go down inside the fitting. I'm literally just putting a small smear all the way around the edge of the fitting. And there we go. Happy with that. Now I just wipe off what's left on my finger. Now I get my pipe and I very carefully slip the fitting onto the pipe, making sure that I don't scrape any of that joinery compound off the edge of the seating. And like I said before, we want to make sure that none of this joinery compound gets down inside the pipe and ends up being washed around the system. So let's just pull it off and have a look to see if any of it has. And you can see down inside the fitting is completely clean, and also in the pipe. There's no joinery compound there either. So what you don't want to do is to get a great big blob on your finger like this, and then blob that all over the inside of the fitting. So you've got a big covering like that. That is not what you want to do, because then when I get the pipe and I push the pipe down inside the fitting, it's going to push all that joinery compound down inside. And there you go. Look, you can see loads of joinery compound down inside the fitting there. And if I take the pipe apart again, you can see all that joinery compound has been pushed down inside the fitting. And obviously that is not what we want at all. And that's just going to get washed around the system and block things up, giving us problems. And like I always say, we don't want more problems. I want to quickly jump in here and introduce myself. My name is Mark Ballard and I've been a gas engineer for 30 years. The aim of my channel is to help you with your gas boilers and your central heating. If you find this video at all useful, then please give me a little bit of feedback by clicking on that thumbs up or the subscribe, and that will help others to find the video. And of course, you can share the video with your friends. If you visit my website, I've categorized all my videos on products and parts that I recommend, so you can easily find what you're looking for. And I'd like to say a really big thank you to everybody who's bought me a cup of coffee and left me a donation in my Toolbox fund. It's really appreciated, and it does really help me to make more videos, which will hopefully help you. Right, so let's put this back together and then carefully slide the olive onto the seating like that. And then we're going to see a little bit of that joining compound ooze out. And then I can push the nut down and do it up finger tight. And then of course do it up with the spanners. So let's do this joint up nice and tight. And then we're going to loosen it off again and take a look inside the fitting and see what's happened to that joining compound. So let's just undo this fitting, and now we can see there is a nice ooze of joining compound all the way around the olive. And that looks just about perfect to me, and that is exactly what I'm looking for. So let's just carefully take it apart and see what the olive looks like and what the fitting looks like. And you can see again, there's a nice covering all the way around the edge of the front of the olive. And of course, there's a little bit on the pipe as well. And if I take a look at the fitting and the seating, that looks perfectly okay as well. And no joining compound has gone down inside the fitting or the pipe. Again, this would be a 100% leak-free joint. Now let's take a look at another way to seal a compression fitting. Now this method I rarely use, but it can be useful on certain occasions. Now you can see this is called joining compound and external leak sealer. Now this is a clear sealant, and it is the most expensive way to seal your compression fitting. Now I would apply this exactly the same as the first method of the joining compound. So I just get a bit of the silicone sealant, I just wipe it onto the pipe like that, I then smear it around the pipe to create a nice covering of the silicone sealant, and then I'd slide the olive up onto the sealant. And then I carefully go around the olive, applying a little more silicone sealant to the front face of the olive. And this is a brass olive opposed to a copper olive. I'll go into olives in a bit more detail in just a minute. And then I take my fitting, which in this case is a stop valve, and I just smear a tiny amount onto the seating of the fitting. With the silicone sealant, it's really important that we don't get any down inside the pipe, because it may get washed around the system and then set in the wrong place, giving you another problem. Now, a place where I may use this method is maybe on an electric shower or maybe a concealed shower, where the fitting is never going to move, we're never going to want to take it apart, and a leak would be a disaster. Having said that, shower companies will often tell you not to use joining compound on their joints. But as long as you are very careful, you're never going to get any of that sealant inside the shower. And of course, you should always stick to the manufacturer's instructions. Right, there you go. I've done that fitting up nice and tight. Now let's take it apart again and take a quick look inside. So let's undo the nut and now carefully pull the pipe out of the fitting. And there we go. It looks exactly the same as all the other fittings. A nice covering of silicone sealant, and no sealant has gone down inside the pipe. So how do we go about making the joint onto plastic pipework? Now this is Polyplumb pipework, but there's lots of different brands out there, but they all do the same thing, and you just need to follow the same process. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to trim my pipework off square to the marker on the pipe. So just trim that off like that. Then we just pop on the nut, slip on the olive like that. And then what we must do is to add an insert into the pipe. So this is a Polyplumb insert, and I just push that down and I make sure it goes all the way into the pipe. Now some inserts come with additional O-rings on them. Now it's not recommended to use those inserts with compression fittings because it pushes the pipe further down the fitting. And then the olive is just on the edge of the pipe, which obviously isn't a great idea. And you can see here, I've only got about 1/4 of an inch before the end of the pipe. Imagine if I put a sleeve on which had an O-ring on it, it would then push the pipe further down, and I'd only have about 1/8 of an inch, or maybe less, of the olive on the pipe, which isn't a great idea. You don't want that pipe bursting off. Now there's a lot of videos out there telling you to put these joints together dry. Now like I said earlier, I do not recommend putting any compression fittings together dry. Obviously, it's entirely up to you. But that leak I told you about underneath the bath, that was exactly the same. It had plastic pipe, copper olive, and an isolation valve. And there was nothing wrong with the joint, and yet it started leaking several months later. So my lesson was learned, and I've never put a compression fitting together without using some sort of additional sealing method. So there you are, I've done that one out dry. Now let's take it apart and take a quick look. Now the thing is, the copper olive compresses down onto the plastic really well. And I think that makes a really good seal. But you've still got the copper against the brass on the fitting to seal the fitting. And I think that's the most likely place you're going to get a leak. And of course, the sleeve is there to support the pipe and make sure that the olive is tight on the pipe. If you don't use a sleeve, there's a possibility that the pipe at some point might shrink and then burst off. And you definitely don't want that. So I just use the same methods which I use on all my compression fittings. So I put the nut on, I put the olive on, and then I'm going to use some PTFE tape and just wrap it around the olive. And if it guarantees that the joint isn't going to leak, then why wouldn't you do it? Because like I said many times, no one wants a leak. So there you go, you can see I've wrapped PTFE tape several times around the front of the olive there, snap the tape off, get the fitting, push it onto the pipe. Obviously make sure you've got that insert inside the pipe, push the olive down onto the fitting, do up the nut, and then tighten the joint up with our spanners. Now, when you do nuts up onto plastic pipe, you'll find that the olive will keep compressing onto the pipe and you can keep turning for some time. So it's a bit of a judgment to how tight you should make it because the plastic pipe will keep squashing. So let's take a look at how this joint has turned out. You can see the PTFE has squashed down nicely onto the olive. And you can see there, we've got a nice ring of PTFE tape all the way around the edge of the olive there, obviously where it is butting up against the brass fitting. And that's my recommendation for compression fittings on plastic pipes. Nobody wants water dripping through their sealing. Now here's a very important point about putting compression fittings together. When we are doing the joint up, we always want to hold the fitting. Don't hold the pipe or a joint below it, always hold the fitting like I am here. And then get your adjustable spanners and do up the nut whilst holding the fitting. And try and make sure that the old pipework doesn't get twisted and cause a leak somewhere else. Now here's that T which I've just put together and I've added another bit of pipe on the other end of the T. Instead of holding the fitting, I'm now holding both nuts. Now when I do up the nut here, you'll see that the other end starts to twist. And if this was an old fitting and I was just changing the bit of pipework on the top, that lower joint might start leaking in the future. And of course we don't want that. And when you're doing up a T like this, don't be tempted to hold the pipe. Always hold the fitting, because if you don't and you hold the pipe, then the fitting may twist and actually kink the pipe. And then you've got more problems to sort out. And of course, if you're doing up an elbow, do exactly the same. Hold the fitting, don't hold the pipe, and then do up the nut that way. It's really tempting to hold the pipe, but always try and hold the fitting. Even if it's more awkward and takes a long time to do, we don't want any leaks. Another very important thing to watch out for is the pipes are nice and clean and not damaged in any way. So say this pipe was in a cupboard, I've just cut through it because I want to add something onto it. It looks great, but when I get my mirror and I look around the back, I can see there's a dent in the pipe. And obviously that's no good. If I put my compression fitting onto there, it's going to end up leaking. So if I turn that pipe around now, there you go, there's that dent in the pipe. Now it's really surprising how often when I look around the back of a pipe, it's actually damaged. Maybe it's got a scratch on it or paint on it. And of course, any of those can cause a leak. So I always use an inspection mirror and look around the back just to make sure that the pipework is nice and clean before fitting any fitting onto a pipe. Another thing to watch out for on pipes is scratches or lines in the pipes which have been made when the pipe has been manufactured. Both of these can cause leaks, maybe not straight away, but maybe in the future, you might get some water seeping out. So what I always do is I get a file and I file away any marks which are on the pipework. That's scratches, manufacturer's lines, paintwork, anything that is on the pipework. I want to see a lovely, shiny pipework. And when you're using a file, you want to use this kind of rotation method so you don't get a flat spot on the pipe. You can see I'm sort of rotating it. Don't go straight across it. Go like that in that kind of curved motion, and then the pipe will stay round. And there you can see, and now filed that scratch out. A quick look all the way around the pipe, and you can see the pipe is now nice and clean. After I've finished filing out any scratches or tiny dents, I'll then get an abrasive strip like this and just rub it around the entire pipe and make sure it has a nice smooth finish all the way around. And there we go, this bit of pipework is spotless now, lovely and shiny all the way around. Now, a quick word about olives. In general, olives are made of two different materials. You have copper olives like this one, which are a nice copper colour, and then you have brass olives like these other ones, which are like a gold colour. And the brass ones sometimes have these rings in, you can see, but in general, they do exactly the same thing. And when you buy a valve or a fitting that has compression fittings on it, you don't get a choice of what olive comes in the fitting. They both work the same on the pipe, but they are different, and I'll explain why. Now, a copper olive is very soft and it squashes down quite easily and can fill in those little gaps which you might have, whereas a brass olive is much harder and it doesn't crush down as easily. So if a pipe is misshaped a bit, then brass olive may not be a good choice. And when it comes to removing an olive from a pipe, a copper olive is a lot easier to remove than a brass olive. Another thing to note is they can be different sizes. You can see this brass olive is a lot wider than this copper olive. So I might choose this brass larger olive over the smaller copper olive, depending on the pipework and fitting I'm using it on. But in general, I always tend to use copper olives rather than a brass olive, because I feel they just squash down that little bit better. And finally, let me just tell you about Imperial Pipework. If you have an older property, there's a possibility you're going to have some Imperial Pipework. So instead of being 15mm pipework, it might be 1/2 inch pipework. But 15mm pipework and 1/2 inch pipework are pretty much the same. So you can use a standard 15mm compression fitting. Now 28mm pipework and inch pipework, that's pretty much the same. But 22mm pipework, the equivalent is 3/4 of an inch, and that is not the same size. Now you can buy a little pack of 3/4 olives, especially to fit that old 3/4 pipework. Now the olives look kind of the same, but it is a little bit smaller. You can see it just won't quite fit onto this 22mm pipework. Now here's a standard 22mm olive. You see it slides on there nicely. Now this 3/4 one, it doesn't quite fit. So all you need to do is to replace the standard 22mm olive with this 3/4 olive, and then you can do the fitting up that way. Now, if you want to know how to remove an olive, I made a video on 5 different ways to remove an olive, and obviously you can find that video linked in the usual places. Now, a good demonstration that copper and brass olives are different is the stop valve I made up earlier. It came with brass olives and I sealed the joint with LX sealant. And when I did the joint up, I did it to the same tightness as I would normally do. And then I removed the stopcock to show you what happened to sealant. Now what's interesting is that the olive is still loose on the pipe. Like I can actually slide it off, although the fitting was tight. And that's the difference with a copper olive and a brass olive. The copper olive would have squashed down and actually been tight on the pipe, and I'd probably have to get my grips to wiggle it off. But a much harder brass olive, although it would have squashed down and sealed the joint, when I released the nut, the olive sprung back to its original shape. So I would have to do up the joint a lot tighter if I wanted to permanently deform the shape of the brass olive. But I'm not sure when I would want to do that. Now you can see I've just replaced that brass olive with a copper olive, and when I undo the nut, you'll see that that softer copper olive has squashed down permanently onto the pipe. And there you go, you can see that that copper olive is now tight on the pipe. And to remove the olive, like I said, I've got to use my grips to wiggle the olive off. And that's why I prefer to use copper olives. They're just that little bit softer and I feel they make a better seal on the pipe. Right, that's about it for compression fittings. I really hope this video has helped you out and you now know where and how to use compression fittings. And as I'm always saying, belt and braces, and we don't want any leaks. Right, that's about it then. So I do hope this video has helped you out with the compression fittings. If it has, then please give me that little bit of feedback by clicking on the old thumbs up and click on subscribe. And of course, you can share it with anyone else who may be interested. If you want to watch my next video, which is all about my flushing, then you can click on that link just there. If you want to know how not to put radiator valves together, click on that link just there. And like I say, big thank you to everybody who's left a donation in my Toolbox Fund. Really appreciated. Bye for now, and I hope to see you in the next video.